Abraham Lincoln, Part 2. Abe grew straight up into the air like a fir tree. Long and thin he was, with big hands and feet jutting out. His buckskin breeches were always too short and too tight and made blue circles on his legs where they squeezed him. "I can always wash your muddy footsteps from the floor," teased his stepmother. "But keep your head clean, Abe, so you won't be leaving tracks along my whitewashed ceiling." Abe grinned, scratched his head, and thought of a joke. When his stepmother went out for a while, he took a little boy with muddy feet and lifted him up and walked him like a fly across the ceiling. "Abe, I should thrash you," said his stepmother when she came back, but she laughed at the joke instead, and with a pail of whitewash, Abe made the ceiling white and clean again. Often for days at a time, Abe stayed alone in the woods chopping timber. It was so quiet in the forest, and he had plenty of time to think and dream. At meal times, he shared his food with the squirrels, and in return, they had to listen to the speeches he made up. The squirrels blinked their small brown eyes, and the trees seemed to sway and bow in agreement with what he said. He made a poem for his sister Sally, and when she married and left home, he read it at her wedding. Abe also left home for a while to be a ferryman on the Ohio River. The great Ohio River flowed by some miles from Little Pigeon Creek, and it was there that he made his first dollar. Two elegant travelers gave him a shiny $half each for rowing them out to the steamboat that lay anchored in midstream. But as he stood there in his ferry boat, wondering that anyone could pay so much for so little work, one of the coins slipped out from between his fingers. Sadly, Abe saw half of his new wealth vanish in the depths. But Abe hadn't much time to grieve over his loss. Too many things happened on the river. He looked wide-eyed at the boats and listened to tales of the outside world. Then one day, one of the neighboring farmers sent Abe himself out into the world. With a flatboat loaded with hogs and corn, the farmer's son and Abe set off to go all the way down to New Orleans to trade. They drifted with their boat down the Ohio River and into the great Mississippi River. We know this is the river that travels down the front of the middleman. There, Abe needed all his strength and quick thinking to steer clear of the many dangers. Paddle wheel steamers splashed up and down the river so hard that the water churned in a foam about them. Flatboats and keelboats and houseboats in strings drifted into their path. Dangers lurked behind every bend. Sandbars were washed up by the current, and straggling trees, sticking up from the bottom, threatened to pin the boat up in the air like a beetle. Along the shores, river pirates lay in hiding, waiting for nightfall to come. One night, as Abe and his friend had made fast their boat at the bank, 5 vicious pirates came sneaking on board to rob them, but they hadn't counted on the strength of Big Abe. He grabbed an oar, fought them all at once, and chased them far into the swamp. Abe could never forget this night. For the rest of his life, he had a white scar over his eyebrow. The further south they drifted, the more Negro slaves they saw working in the cotton fields. And when at last they came to New Orleans, there were black slaves everywhere. Some were running about with loads on their heads. Others were led in chains through the streets to be sold at slave markets. And Abe saw how Negroes were trotted up and down like horses to show that they were strong and healthy. So maybe you already know about slavery and maybe you don't. So just in case, slavery in the United States was when white people would actually buy black people, and the black people would work for the white people for no money. It was a really horrible time in American history. And that is what Abraham Lincoln is witnessing right now in the story. The Negro mothers were weeping, for they never knew if they would ever see their little black babies again when they were sold. Sometimes the one who bought the mother would refuse to take the children, and then they would be sold to someone else, and the family would be broken up. Abe Lincoln thought that was cruel, and when the cargo and the flatboat were sold, he was glad to go north again to his Indiana home, where everyone was free. So there were certain parts of our country in the north where slavery was not allowed, but in the south it was allowed. So that's what he was seeing down in Louisiana. There, all the neighbors came to hear him tell of his adventures out in the big world. They never tired of hearing about the river pirates and the slave markets, and they all grinned broadly when he told of the fortune teller who had said that he, Abraham Lincoln, would one day be president of the United States. Abe's father was listening to stories about Illinois, the new prairie state, where folks said the grass grew greener than anywhere else. Uh-oh, what do you think the dad's gonna say? I reckon we'll be moving on, he said one day. So one early spring morning, the Lincolns set off again, this time in a wagon so huge that a 7-yoke ox team had to pull it. Wow, that's 14 oxen. The wagon was crowded, for many relatives moved with them. They traveled on for 2 whole weeks through forests and swamps and rolling prairie. On long legs, Abe walked in front to peddle pins and buttons, when once in a while they passed a farm. When they came to Sangamon River in Illinois, they liked the land and put up a cabin. Abe split mountains of rails for fences. 1,000 rails he split for a neighbor to get himself a pair of jeans. That was much work for a pair of pants, but then his legs were long too, so it took many yards of cloth to cover them. And when spring came, he said goodbye to his father and his stepmother, put his belongings into a bundle, threw it over his shoulder, and set out into the world to try his luck. For now he had reached 21 years old and was free to do as he pleased. A little further down the Sangamon River lay the village of New Salem. It had only a few dozen houses, but even Chicago did not have more at that time. There were several stores in New Salem, and a man named Offutt was planning to open a new one. One of his trips up the river to Offutt met tall Abe and hired him as a clerk in the store he was going to open. But first he sent him down to New Orleans with goods to sell. Abe built a flatboat for himself and drifted down the Sangamon River. But off New Salem, a miller had built a dam across the river, and on this mill dam, the flatboat stuck. All the people of the village stood on the bank and waited to see the flatboat sink. But Abe bored a hole in the boat and tipped it so the water could flow out, and slowly the flatboat slid over the dam. Then he put a wedge in the hole and drifted on down the river. There was a mighty smart fellow, everyone said. Offutt went around bragging and betting that his huge new clerk was not only smart enough to outwit them all, but so strong that he could outrun, outjump, and outfight any man in the county. So when Abe came back to New Salem, all the strong boys were strutting about, eager to measure their strength against his. And Abe had to make good Offutt's words. That means he had to prove that what Offutt said was true. So he wrestled with the strongest and toughest of them all and threw them to the ground. Then the beaten boy and all the people cheered and said Abe was the strongest man in the county. From that day they accepted him as one of them. They loved his funny ways and jokes, and they nicknamed him Honest Abe. Once he charged a woman 6 1/4 cents too much, and he walked 3 miles to catch up with her and pay her back. But Abe's honesty wasn't enough to keep Offutt's store going. The debts grew bigger and bigger, and one morning Offutt was gone. There stood Abe without a job. But just then the men of New Salem were called to war, for an Indian chief, Black Hawk, had come back to Illinois with his warriors. His tribe had sold the land to the Paleface, which were the white people, but Black Hawk said, "Manitou, the Great Spirit, gave us the land. It couldn't be sold." "Sold is sold," said the people of Illinois, and went to war to chase the Indians out. Abe Lincoln went to war as captain, for the man from each village who had the longest row of men lined up behind him was elected captain, and twice as many men lined up behind Abe as behind his rival. But his soldiers had never taken orders from any man before, and Captain Abe Lincoln struggled hard to make them obey him. That was all the fighting he had, for Black Hawk and his warriors fled before the soldiers. One day, a peaceful old Indian came walking into camp. The soldiers were angry and wanted to kill him, but Abe said, "Anyone who touches him must fight me first." And because Abe was the strongest, they had to obey. Soon after that, Black Hawk was taken prisoner, and the Indian War was over. Abe went back to New Salem, and he and another young man named Barry decided to open a store of their own. Both were poor, but Abe's word was good as gold, so they borrowed the money, bought the goods, and started to trade. Very soon, Abe's friends were saying he was too clever to stand behind the counter all day long. He should go around making speeches so the people would elect him to go to the capital of Illinois. Abe thought this was a very good idea, so he began going about making speeches and joking with people. When he had mounted a tree stump, he started, "I am humble Abraham Lincoln," and the people liked what he said and his funny ways, and they elected him. Every spring he went to the capital. The rest of the year he took care of his store, but all the time he wanted to study to become a lawyer. And it happened that one day, as he was standing in his store, a covered wagon stopped at the door and a stranger came in with a barrel of old stuff he wanted to sell. Abe had no need for the barrel, but he bought it for $50 just to help the man. And when he opened the barrel, he found at the bottom the book he needed to study law. From then on, Abe lay most of the time on the counter and studied the book, and the schoolmaster helped him with grammar and English. In the meantime, Barry took care of the store, but instead of selling the goods, he ate and drank the whole day long, and at last he died. There was Abe with all the debts. That means he owed money and he didn't have it. It was more than $1,000 he owed. His store was taken away from him, and all that he owned was sold at an auction. Abe's father had taught him, if you make a bad bargain, hug it all the tighter. So instead of running away, Abe stayed and toiled to pay back all the debts. That means he worked really hard. His friends believed in him, and most of all, a girl whose name was Anne Rutledge. She was sure he would become a great man someday, if he would just go on with his studies. And then they would be married and be happy ever after. But one day, Anne Rutledge took sick and nothing could be done to save her life. From that day on, it was as if there were two Abes, the one who was happy and full of funny stories, and the other who was so sad and sorrowful that no one dared to approach him. Oh, how devastating. But he did his work and finished his studies, and one morning he took leave of his friends in New Salem. He borrowed a horse, and sad and penniless, he rode off to Springfield, the capital of Illinois, to become a lawyer. In Springfield, he hitched up his horse on the main square and went into the store of Joshua Speed to ask the price of betting. "I have no money, but if I succeed, I'll pay you back," he said to Speed. But Speed felt sorry for sad-faced Abe and told him to take his things upstairs and share his own bed for nothing. From that time on, Joshua Speed was Abe Lincoln's best friend. He took him to the homes of all his elegant friends, and Abe bought himself store clothes, put a stovepipe hat on his head, and by, the country lad was changed into a well-known lawyer. From the prairie all around, people came to ask his advice, for they knew he would be fair and square, and the people in Springfield began to say that the two cleverest men in town were awkward Abraham Lincoln and stylish Judge Douglas. The one was large and small, the other was lean and tall, and they both courted Mary Todd, a lady from Kentucky. She was dainty and witty, with a tongue so sharp that few people but Abe could tongue-tie her. So both of these men are interested in the same woman named Mary Todd. Uh-oh, I wonder what's going to happen there. We'll find out tomorrow.